Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Evolving Your Incentive Structure Using Patient Journey Insights to Empower Field Teams. I'm Michelle Benz with Fierce Biotech, and I'm delighted to welcome our speakers today. We have Jim Costello, Vice President of TGaS Advisors, a division of Trinity Life Sciences, Mohammed Issa, Vice President, Head of U.S. Dermatology and Rheumatology, the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson, and Jason Plant, Regional Sales Leader, Mid-Atlantic at Aurinia Pharmaceuticals. Now, before I jump in, I'm going to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves. Jason, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hi. My name's Jason Plant. I'm, like I was mentioned, I'm a regional sales leader with Aurinia Pharmaceuticals. Been in the industry since 2003. I'm married to my lovely wife, Kathleen. I have two young daughters, Remy and Lila, who just finished school yesterday. So they're very happy on summer break.
Great. Jim?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Costello. I lead the incentive compensation practice at TGaS Advisors. I have been involved in pharmaceutical sales compensation for the better part of 25 years on the vendor side. So I have a passion for this topic, and people have often heard me say, the one thing I'm convinced of after 25 years is that incentives will drive behavior. So getting the behaviors right and figuring out how to measure people appropriately is part of the puzzle of incentive comp that I really enjoy.
Great. And Mohammed?
Good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. Mohammed Issa. I get the fortune of leading our dermatology and rheumatology business here in the U.S. for Janssen Pharmaceuticals. Been in the space for close to 2 decades, leading different commercial functions and inevitably leading multifunctional commercial organizations. Excited to be here. Looking forward to learning from my esteemed panelists here. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you. Let's jump in with a question. I'm going to direct this to you, Jason, at first. What are some gaps you see from the current performance metrics being used today?
It's kind of a loaded question, right? That's, one of my I think we discussed this before. One of my least favorite terms is the term metric, right? I think the only metric that matters is, whether or not a patient who needs therapy gets therapy. I mean, I think that's all of our missions, right? Is to go out and help as many patients as we can. But I do think that the gap that exists now just is around how we monitor the performance of our field-based teams. I think that there has been a lot of focus in the industry on monitoring calls per day, reach and frequency, and really I think the biggest issue that I see with those metrics is that the folks that are entering them know they're being monitored, right? So they kind of cease to be objective when the folks that are responsible for entering the calls are the ones that are going to be asked later. Well, we need you to do 5 calls a day, and you only did 4.7. Well, they'll make sure it's 5 next time. So that's probably, I think, one of our biggest issues is just how we measure effectiveness of our sales teams outside of just looking at how many calls they make and how many patients get started on treatment. It's kind of a tricky one.
Mohammed, would you agree?
I think so, yeah. Look, I think the fundamental gap directly articulated is data. The integrity of data sets that we use, the level of data penetration at every level of the organization, the timeliness of those data could sometimes put us in a position where we are projecting performance more so than assessing performance. And I think the more organizations have sophistication around data, which all of us are investing in, the more I think we're going to close some of those gaps across every function in the field. So I would maybe answer that question directly and just say I think some of the gaps come from the limitations in the data sets that we're currently using and that are currently available.
Absolutely. Now I want to start talking a little bit about the opportunities or new metrics that can solve some of these problems. And I'm not sure if either or any of you have ever worked with these or kind of contemplated this, but I'll throw it over to Jim to see if he's had any ideas.
It's a great question. I think one of the things we run into is there's this tension of when we want to measure individual contribution, we want to measure the impact to the business. We've mentioned some of the data shortcomings, but again, it goes back to really clearly articulating the outcomes that you want. So, I think Jason used an interesting term earlier of, getting patients on therapy. I look at what are the critical steps in that patient journey. Where are decision points happening in that patient journey, and is it possible to pick up on those metrics or pick up on those decision points and convert them into incentive comp measures? I refer to it as, has the representative driven someone to a decision, whether it's prescribing the product, entering a patient into a portal where we're able to monitor that patient. Is there some action that's been taken that the representative has influenced that isn't necessarily a prescription or a sales outcome that we typically like to measure? I think we had talked when we had spoken about this earlier, measures like time to treat, right? We know there's an intent. We know that there's a point where a prescription or a drug is administered, and the time it takes from the intent to the administration. Can we measure that? Can we shorten that time frame? Again, positive outcome for a patient, but also a positive outcome for our business, right? Those are kind of the magical measures that we're all looking for. And as I mentioned, something like time to treat is an interesting one. Again, assuming that the individual has influence or is being asked to interact and at those individual decision points.
Jason, did you want to add anything about
performance?
I
really do agree with what Jim said. I think that oftentimes it's funny. I actually just left a meeting, a management meeting, a sales leaders meeting, and we were talking about this exact thing. It's especially when you get into rare disease, right? It's not always a direct path for the patient, right? It is important to help these, consider the patient journey and do what we can, as a pharmaceutical manufacturer, as part of this industry, to really help these patients along that path, which will ultimately. So that's what makes it tough, right? It's like, sometimes you have to weigh the balance of, okay, we need to, report to our shareholders and make sure that we can keep the lights on around here, but also, it's an infinite game that we're really in. There's no, unless the disease is totally cured by whatever treatment we have, which is pretty rare. How long they're on treatment, keeping them on treatment, getting them diagnosed so that they even know what disease they have so they can be treated. There's a lot of different things that play into it. And then, obviously the tension, I think, that Jim mentioned is a good way to describe it. There's a lot of tension in trying to figure out, what takes priority, for, when you're looking at your team.
Yeah, and I have when I've talked to sales leaders, I often hear people express the concern. Well, how do we pay or reward the rep who's doing everything right, but hasn't gotten a patient yet? And I truthfully, I push back and say, okay, well, tell me how you know that rep is doing everything right. What is it? Right. What is it that you're seeing? What observable proof is there that representative is doing everything right? Because within that conversation is where these metrics live, right? That's how these non-traditional patient-focused metrics get pulled out. It's not it's not through necessarily looking for some particular data source or some particular new thing somebody is presenting to you, but it's what are the specific behaviors that we believe reasonably will lead to success, will lead to a better patient interaction, will lead to a better customer experience. If we can find those, that's where these non-traditional metrics live. I think we had talked also before about things like responsiveness to medical information requests. Right? That's something everybody tracks. Everybody knows when a customer has reached out for a request for medical information. We tend to shy away from anything that has to do with medical information from an incentive comp perspective because we get the compliance concerns about it. But at the same time, it's reasonable to assume that the better, the quicker, and the more accurately we as a company respond to those requests for medical information, that leads to a better outcome. And if we can, if the only role a representative has in that transaction is making sure that we get a response within 24 hours or 12 hours, let's consider measuring that as an outcome that we have influence over. Is not necessarily sales-based, but a reasonable person would suggest that should lead to a positive outcome from a sales perspective.
And Mohammed, I want to make sure we get your perspective in here as well. Is there, maybe some reimagined incentive structure that you're working on, or some new metrics that you're trying to track, or what are ways that you're motivating and guiding your field team?
Look, I think you'd have to start that discussion by appreciating that there are now a multiple of different field teams that are heterogeneous with different objectives and remits. And while there are different measures you can put in place, I think it behooves, the leadership team of those organizations to consider what are the objectives of those individual teams. How do you ensure that the incentives are aligning to those objectives and not creating a complexity by adding new measures into an incentive comp plan, especially to a team that may not necessarily have influence over those measures? So I'm even kind of perusing through the questions, and there's thoughts here around how are you thinking about different innovative ways around the patient journey. Well, the truth of the matter is the traditional sales role may not necessarily be deployed to anything else other than driving demand. Different sales teams may be deployed with different things. Perhaps they have different objectives. But should you assume that that's true, you can't necessarily measure a demand generation organization on patient outcomes because that's not what they influence. So if you have other field teams, whether they be access and reimbursement specialists, whether they be patient navigators, whether they be customer service types of organizations, whether they be patient support programs, both in field and on the back end, I think that's where you can start to deploy some of these unique KPIs into some of those incentive plans. But I think the trap is to get enamored by some of these newer patient journey metrics and put them into a performance, indication dashboard or incentive comp plan for teams that may not always have influence over that. So I would maybe just kind of start there and maybe pose the discussion to my peers here on the line just to kind of fodder some thought. But fundamentally, I'd say, yes, there's a lot of things you can measure, but I think you have to start by measuring the things that matter the most to that group, and more importantly, what that group inevitably influences as part of their day-to-day objectives.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just so funny that we're having this discussion. I literally just had this discussion at my own company just this week, and I think it's the thing that we were struggling with as a group is like, you bring up Mohammed, you bring up demand generation, right? I mean, once a salesperson interacts with the clinician, and the clinician at one point or the other, because that's the other thing in rare disease that's a little tricky is there could be huge gaps of time between the time the rep saw the doc or had the interaction about that disease and the treatment, and when the doc actually sees the patient and makes that treatment decision, right? So there's big gaps there. You know, there's different ways to access the therapy, right? So like we have a closed distribution network for our therapy, so there's a different start form and a different process there. And what we were struggling with as a management and sales team was trying to figure out, okay, do we, you know, if the compensation to the rep is only paid on whether or not they get a start form, and they only ever get start forms, and those don't ever pan out to actually be patients on therapy, which result in revenue for the organization, you know, you can't really justify paying a representative for their efforts just to get the start form, and then it never ends up, you know, with the ultimate goal of getting a patient on treatment, which would bring revenue to the organization. So just trying to figure that out, right? Because to your point, Mohammed, the behavior that we're after is to get the clinician to commit to put the patient on treatment, right? I mean, that's their responsibility, and they don't have as much control over always what happens after that, right? PBMs. I mean, we can go all the way into it, but there's a lot of things that can make it tough for that patient to get put on treatment ultimately, right? So where do we? I guess my question back to the panel is, how do we figure out where the representatives' responsibilities end and the rest should fall on the organization, I guess, as a whole?
Well, I can give an example of sort of an interesting approach I saw. I worked with a client on the client in question. Their drug had a profile that the side effects initially were kind of challenging. And they had a pattern where they would get patients to start, but patients would drop off relatively quickly because of the side effect profile. And the company had data saying that, if you can get past the first X number of weeks, the side effects dissipate. Well, in this case, this company wanted representatives more engaged in this discussion of managing and helping doctors with with messages around side effects. They had previously paid on new patient acquisition. They actually stopped paying on and switched it to, no, we're not going to pay you until the third transaction, right? Till they get their second or third refill. Now, again, we're looking at having access to pretty granular data, but that was consistent with what the messaging was okay, it's one thing to get the patient started, but it's much more valuable to both the patient and our company to get them over this side effect hump. So this was an example where the representative, as Mohammed was saying, this was something that was within their scope of responsibility. It was a traditional metric, but with a slightly different twist to reflect a different behavior that they wanted the reps to demonstrate. I thought it was pretty effective thinking around what role that particular field team played in this patient journey. It's always a challenge in these discussions to come up with measures that could be universally applicable, because by definition, the patient journey is relatively unique, right? I think it's helpful to talk through examples, because it is finding these spots where you can really drive in on the behaviors you want to reward.
Actually, James, that's a perfect transition. So what does having full insight into the patient journey mean? Or what do those advantages and insights provide?
Well, as the consultant in the group, I can give you the "it depends" answer.
Always does.
But it does. It gives you the opportunity to identify, as I've said, decision points or particular issues within the patient journey that the appropriate individual in the customer-facing team can influence. and can intervene on to make that patient journey smoother. And the key, and again, as Mohammed said, was trying to find those moments. But I certainly think that we're hearing, and our customers in this on the sales side of things spend more time talking about the patient journey. And I think that the customers that are really doing that and digging in on it are coming up with some of these more effective metrics. So I think it's critical now to have as much vision into that patient journey and to really incorporate that into your thinking.
Absolutely. Jason, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I mean, putting the patient up front is always important, right? I mean, that's why we do what we do. And I think that should, I think saying that and then actually like walking that walk is sometimes two different things too. It's hard, right? Because we are, oftentimes for-profit organizations that have shareholders to report to, right? And there's, I'll go back to the tension thing, right? There's that tension there always of, it's hard to continue to serve patients if you don't have the support of the financial community, and and you're not driving revenue, you're not going to have that, right? So I think it's important just to, if you keep the patient at the center of all you do, though, I think more times than not it will work itself out. But it's the example that I was talking about in our case, with I could think of examples of, like if the state the reps in makes a formulary decision, that they're not, they're going to make it difficult for this therapy to be approved, and the rep's generating demand, but it's not necessarily paying off. Is that the rep's fault? You know what I mean? Like that's where it gets a little tricky, because you don't want to discourage the behavior of the representative actually being out there doing exactly what you're asking them to do.
Absolutely. And Mohammed, can you share some? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. No, please comment.
And say, can you share some patient outcomes that we want to drive to our sales incentive structure or sales strategy?
Look, I think patient outcomes is and maybe customer HCP experience are maybe two different things, and I'd maybe put them on the table for consideration. Again, I go back to maybe even starting with the previous question around the importance of the patient journey and the insights around it, right? If, to Jim's point, we were deliberate around mapping out the step-by-step process across that patient journey, and then we were honest with ourselves as to which field teams we have influence which parts of those patient journeys, and then consider then performance measurements that assess our impact against those points in time. When we think about patient outcomes, right, you think about patient, fulfillment, like fulfilling their prescription. You think about persistency, you think about adherence, you think about overall clinical outcomes. And this is no offense to the selling organizations that are on the line. I don't know, and I fundamentally don't believe that the selling organization influences those things. The selling organization influences the HCP's ability to identify the appropriate patient for that medication and to support that office to the extent that they can, perhaps not even all the way sometimes, to get that patient started on therapy. So holding them account to patient outcomes may be a bold aspiration, but I'm not sure it will lead to high engagement with the sales force. Instead, I wonder if it's traditional demand generation and keeping it simple. I appreciate the request for innovation, but perhaps the best way to do it is just to stick to the fundamentals, do those really well, and then maybe add elements around customer experience, not necessarily patient outcomes. So how is the office receiving that sales professional? How is the HCP finding value in the interaction? Do they feel like their education gaps are closed? Do they feel like their patients are supported? And if you do all of those things really well, other things will follow, because good patient outcomes will be a translation of the right patient getting the right medication. So it's, again, on that patient journey, our sales professionals are usually a little bit more upstream. Holding them to downstream outcomes is not only unfair, I think you're going to lose engagement, and I think it will probably be hard to measure. Now, if you have other teams that influence that process across different parts of the journey, then absolutely, let's then identify that and then put some of those performance measures in place. But I think it's bold, I think it's aspirational, and I'm not sure I would subscribe to holding the selling organization accountable for patient outcomes, fundamentally because I'm not sure that they influence them.
Jason, do you want to say something?
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said there. I mean, I think it's, you know, I do like the idea. You know, I'm really big on improving our reputation, right? I think we as pharma, you know, over the years have taken some hits to our reputation, and in the eyes of the public and the clinicians, right, and even in some cases patients. You know, and I think a good path to regain that trust is to, you know, if we want to regain trust and have the clinicians look at us in a favorable way, then we maybe need to start asking them, you know, to Mohammed's point, you know, what would you like to see from your representative? How are they adding value to your office and, you know, and to your practice? I think that would be, now how you measure that, you know, it's a little bit tougher, right? I think it's, you know, you do surveys or however you want to do it, but if we could get there, I think that's a path worth exploring for sure.
Yeah, I would maybe add, just one last thought on this, right, Jason, to your point, like, partly it's surveys, but partly it's also, appropriate patient identification. It's partly message recall. It's partly brand recognition at the
Yeah.
right time in their clinical continuum. And if the provider is doing all of those things right, you would have to believe that the services we're providing into those offices are relevant, right? So, in addition to traditional measures outside of patient outcomes, because they again may not necessarily be influenced by the traditional demand generation team, then what are other things that you can measure, i.e., again, patient identification, i.e., message recall, i.e., service orientation and satisfaction, i.e., utilization of certain resources that will lead to those education gaps being closed. How do you maybe infuse some of those? But then I think the trap there is that if you do too much of that, you start to make a performance management, exercise or a strategic lever like an incentive comp plan way more complex than it needs to be. So there
Yeah.
is an element, I think, of balancing that with also a simple comp plan that people can get behind as well.
So, Jim, can you share an example of patient journey insights that you can leverage to identify new opportunities and guide sales behavior?
Could I share an example of a patient journey insight? Well, I think the previous example that I used, right, where we talked about companies having, patients dropping off after the initial initiation of treatment. I think that was an important insight for this company to understand that they weren't getting, once getting the persistency that they wanted. And to Mohammed's point again, was that something that they wanted their reps to be engaged in? Did a rep have a responsibility to appropriately educate the doctors around this this side effect profile and how to effectively manage patients through it and help patients through that? This company decided that the reps did have a role to play to do that. I think other examples of key decision points. I had another client that had a pediatric rare disease, and it was an ongoing treatment for babies. But one of the things they needed to do was doctors needed to titrate the dose as patients as patients grew. This company looked for and found a way to effectively measure, were doctors appropriately evaluating their patients for titration as their weight increased. Again, another critical point in the patient journey, but that patient journey tends to be so specific that it's hard to come up with a standard measure. But again, I think it's again, if anything, my examples show is that you have to dig in deeply to find those things and make sure that the representative has an appropriate role to play in influencing those things. And if you can, then those things are ripe for measurement and potentially appropriate to measure to include in an incentive comp plan. I think to Mohammed's earlier point, you have to be selective about these. They have to be meaningful. They have to be important, and you can't add too many of them, because complexity is the bane of incentive compensation plans. It requires a fair amount of effort, and it requires a very detailed conversation around the role of the representative and finding these pieces that allow you to measure their impact.
Jason or Mohammed, did either of you want to add an example or share some thoughts?
I guess maybe I'll share a thought versus an example. I think the examples that Jim just shared, I think, are really good. I would also ask, the panelists as well as the participants to contemplate whether or not it's, you as an organization want to make the strategic choice to influence that part of the continuum. So, for example, I can tell you confidently that if we were put up in a similar position as the example that Jim just described around an adverse event or something that was coming in between the first dose and the third dose, even though perhaps the representative may influence that ability to kind of punch through those AEs and get to the third dose and beyond, I can tell you that we as an organization and perhaps my leadership team would not make that choice, because an AE needs to be managed by the clinical provider based on the patient and based on the magnitude of that. So not knowing the details of that, for example, it's a relatively controversial position to take, but I can tell you as an organization, you have to then choose, more importantly, whether or not you want to actually make some of those decisions, and you may not always want to, right? So that's just the only thought I'd add to that, because you have, when you have the luxury of information and insights, you're going to have to choose which ones you want to act on, and more importantly, which ones you don't. And that's, I think, part of the strategic choices that we all have to make as business leaders.
This is starting to remind me of every incentive comp design discussion I've had with a customer, where we circle back to demand generation, because there's a lot that makes sense about demand generation as a metric for a sales representative.
Yeah, I like Absolutely. What Mohammed said earlier. I think it may be more prudent just to keep it simple, right? I mean, I think another way. I mean, I know we're talking about incentive compensation, but I do believe, especially in startup environments, that a great way to motivate the behavior that you want and really to get everybody in together is to use equity as a way to long-term equity for the for the representatives or the managers or whoever to motivate them. I think that's really the two best companies that I ever worked for were companies that were pretty aggressive with the equity they gave to the sales force, and I think that you saw a lot of the behavior that you'd want to see from everybody in the company. It was like we were all aligned. I think it just kind of brings you together, and it's not always possible to do that depending on the size of the organization, but I think especially in the startup environment where there is some risk involved, and it does take more of a, if you want to encourage entrepreneurial spirit in your organization, give people some skin in the game, right? I think that's kind of how I look at it, right? And I think when you can do that, it works really well.
Another example of utilizing the patient journey to help drive decision making in incentive comp just occurred to me, so I thought I'd share this. We very often see, again, there's this strong desire, bias even, if you will, in the industry to measure the contribution at that individual level. So we spend a lot of time chasing patients, making sure we're crediting it to the right territory. If you really understand the patient journey, and we see this a lot in diseases where patients will gravitate to a nationally recognized center for initial diagnosis, but then we'll travel back home for ongoing therapy. If you understand that, then you can start to make decisions around individual versus team metrics, or total sales versus patient initiation, which representatives get credit for which piece. I think even if you're not using individual patient journey metrics in your plan, understanding that patient journey is oftentimes critically important to getting the incentive compensation plan right. I frequently run into companies where that particular issue comes out, and we pose the question, well, who gets credit for that patient? Who gets credit for the subsequent business? Let's think about that, because the answers aren't always clear. And if you don't get that stuff right, then your sales force unfortunately spends the rest of the time looking in the rearview mirror, trying to manage which doctors they're getting credit for, or did or didn't get credit for, which patients they did or didn't get credit for, because we've put some rule in place that doesn't quite make sense, because we didn't kind of accurately spend the time thinking through how does this patient move through a system, and maybe move geographically, right? Again, another very specific example, but it does, I do firmly believe that effective incentive comp design includes an understanding of what that patient journey is, because it can help you avoid landmines like that.
Michelle, Meg asked a good question that I think is related around some ways that we're using that patient journey to ensure those insights are getting the right patients on the medicine. This is maybe a bit controversial, and I apologize if maybe this is not what this is intended to do. But look, if an insight is that deep, that influences brand choice and a patient getting on drug, I would argue that that insight should be leveraged in your brand and commercial strategy that then enables the sales organization and your field customer facing organization to execute flawlessly, more so than that insight being used in the incentive comp plan. So, for example, if there's an insight around sequencing of medicines, or if there's an insight around a particular reason why you would change a class of medicine, or if there's an insight around which class of medicine is preferred when based on that patient journey, whether it's in, rare diseases or non-rare diseases, those types of insights should be influencing your brand strategy, your marketing mix, your marketing message, the tools and resources available to your representatives out in the field, and then holding them to more simple performance indicators to simplify their process in front of their customer. It shouldn't be done, I think at least, or they shouldn't be leveraged squarely in incentive comp. I think maybe there's a balance of both, but if an insight is that deep, I would argue, should you be using it more upstream in the strategy discussions more so than the compensation discussions?
So I'm actually gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna pivot slightly. So if you wanted to comment on that, go ahead.
Fine.
Okay. So using different patient attributes, what are some key ways to leverage social determinants of health data to identify underserved or at-risk populations and strategies for then rewarding disease state education delivered to those populations.
Were you
Mohammed, do
guys
you
at
want
my
to take this
meeting
one?
this week or what?
Oh.
I feel like you were at my meeting this week.
All right, Jason, you're up.
I mean, I'm a big believer in, especially in rare disease, in the value of the team using, being recognized for their efforts to get the word out to not only clinicians, but that it should ultimately spread to patients about the devastating nature of especially a lot of these rare diseases, right? I think that I can give you a quick example of something I just heard, and it really struck home with me. One of my representatives was in seeing a nephrologist, and the nephrologist has a sibling that's an oncologist. And the point he made was that a lot of the patients that he treats with kidney disease, glomerular disease, are at sometimes higher risk than many cancers of mortality. And he said that his brother, it feels like the patients are more willing to take whatever medicine he tells them to take. He gets flowers delivered to him. They bring him candy. They write him notes. And he says, as a nephrologist, he feels like he doesn't get the same feeling from his patients about the seriousness of the disease. And I do think that that's something that we as pharmaceutical manufacturers can help with. Is nephrology is one example. I'm sure there's other examples of other devastating diseases that don't get the press, and don't have the action behind it that cancer does. So that just was something that happened here recently that kind of struck me as an area that we could help with. And I do think that will ultimately, you will see, once again, it's like the infinite game. You will see demand generation if people understand that the disease is more devastating. There's no question about it. It's just hard to measure that, and sometimes it may take a little longer to see the payoff.
I had a client. I had a client once who designed an MBO plan that included representatives having to take a leadership position in their local particular disease state advocacy group, run local programming, create events. There was this particular company, again, decided that was a critical success component of this job, and would ultimately drive demand, and put criteria in place for that. Was an expectation of representatives in this job. Now, whether that needed to be in the incentive plan or that was part of the role description, but this was a company that was willing to do that and say, no, that's something we're going to ask our representatives to do, and we're going to measure whether they do it well or not.
I want to remind everyone that we are going to jump into our Q&A in just a minute. So feel free to type in your questions on the left-hand side of your screen with that Q&A box tab on the left. Now, is there any other thoughts you guys wanted to share before we jump into our Q&A and take some questions from the audience? No? All right. So we're going to jump in. We have a couple great questions. So we'll start with this one. Most organizations measure demand generation through TRX. Do you see companies also recognizing the potentially vastly different GTN implications for prescriptions depending on the payer, and having that reflected in an incentive compensation plan to drive demand where GTN is the highest? I'm not sure who wants to take it.
I'm happy to give you my answer to this question. I think gross to net profitability metrics are really appropriate as part of a call plan, as part of an alignment. I think I started by saying that I believe incentives drive behavior. If you put a profitability incentive in front of a profitability measure as an incentive plan measure, I can too easily lead to conversations and outcomes that I don't want my representative having. Doctor, please don't put your Medicare and Medicaid patients on my drug. Only put patients with third-party insurance on my drug. That's a reasonable thing to do if I'm being measured on gross to net. I would rather see you limit your customer universe by gross to net measures, create targeting and segmentation around gross to net measures. But once you get into that office, you need to be patient agnostic. You can't be. I feel pretty strongly about this one.
Oh, that's good. Is there any other thoughts you guys wanted to join in?
Totally agree. Those are becoming more and more important performance indicators for broader organizations, and because they should be used in the deployment of our field teams, not in the compensation of the field teams. Because once you're in front of a customer, the conversation needs to be about that customer, their patient, the impact that your medicine and solution can have on that patient, and be agnostic of GTN variables in many respects. So if an organization is going to be using those algorithms, I think they should be used to deploy, not to compensate.
I agree too. Consensus on that one.
All right, then. So I know we kind of touched on this one a little bit earlier, but I want to circle back to it. What are some ways when you're doing a patient journey to ensure that you're getting those key insights and that can impact rep ability to get patients on product? Jason, Jim, anything?
I saw this question, and I'm not sure I completely understand it. The patient is the one on the journey. I'm not doing a patient journey. I think I'm gonna need to pass on this one.
Yeah, I tried. I'm with Jim. I tried. Are they trying to say that? I don't know if Meg's still on there. Is she trying to say that? When you're considering the patient journey, are there steps to ensure that you're getting key insights that can impact? Is she trying to say that? Yeah, are there things that are in the? I mean, I can tell you that in the particular disease we work in right now, the patient journey is a big part of. It's a big part of what we consider because patients need to be aware of the devastating nature of the disease, and for example, there's a need for patients to be involved in their own care and be motivated to, once they know they have a disease, and let's say there's a recommendation by a medical body about what the guidelines are around monitoring your disease. It's worthwhile to and it will result in demand later if you can get those patients or encourage patients or help patients get their labs checked when they're supposed to, right? And before it becomes a problem. So I think that if that's kind of where the question was going, I think that it is important, and I think I don't know if it's an innovative way, but I think a way to help with that is to provide education on the devastating nature of the disease.
We have another question. What are your thoughts about a brand that is for acute therapy? The therapy requires significant medical education and HCP awareness of the disease. The length of treatment is only 5 days.
Yeah, I mean, I guess is the question around what do you measure? What do you compensate? I'm assuming, like, what's the compensation structure for something like that?
I'm also assuming that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, and sorry if I'm oversimplifying it, but it's a new to brand dynamic, and unlike brands that are not acute in nature, where you have a new to brand and a total, TRX, perspective. This is just a new to brand dynamic, and you're going to lean into new to brand patients, and you're going to lean into new patient starts more so than maybe something that's a little bit more chronic. So, appreciate the effort that it would take to get up to that utilization. But in that case, identifying the right patient, getting that patient started is probably where you're going to lean into something like that. And then to Jim's point earlier, while I think a lot of us would prefer not to go down the MBO route, at least philosophically, I can tell you that's not, a place I, tend to go. Perhaps that's an area where you add some MBOs around the appropriate activity and pre-work that's associated with educating an office and ensuring that those patients are started accordingly. So there's a time and place for them, and perhaps that's a place to at least consider them.
Yeah, and I always think in terms of tactics versus outcomes. Disease state education, HCP awareness, leading to disease state education certainly is a tactic to achieve an end. What's the outcome? How will you understand that disease state the disease state awareness or HCP medical education? How will you understand that that's happened effectively? If you can find that, then potentially you're looking at something you can measure. I'll use my basic example. Like if I see another teamwork objective again, that we're going to measure teamwork. Teamwork isn't an outcome. Teamwork is a tactic to achieve an outcome. The key is to put a measure in place that can't be achieved unless you work as a team, right? As opposed to putting teamwork in place as a measure. So I think Scott's question, I would be really careful about rewarding tactics rather than outcomes. And is there a way that you can look at your medical education and HCP disease awareness as that you can measure an outcome? Quick example of somebody who did that. I had a client that had access to testing information, so they could find out how many patients were being tested for this disorder. That was that provided them with an opportunity to say, hey, if we're doing more testing, the HCPs are becoming more aware of this as a potential disorder. That was an interesting place for them to dig into from an incentives perspective. Because again, it was an outcome. It was an outcome of it. How do we know we're doing increased disease state awareness? They're testing for the disorder more frequently. In just an interesting way to translate that. But again, tactics versus outcomes is really important to differentiate between the two.
So we have another question. How should measurement and compensation change throughout the patient journey? Anyone want to jump in?
I'm not sure it should.
Okay.
I'm not sure it should. If there are different behaviors required from the representative throughout the patient journey, because you're never having just one patient, right? You've got multiple patients at multiple points in the journey. I think a more appropriate question could potentially be how do incentives change through the product life cycle? That we could certainly have a discussion about, but I'm not certain measurements should change throughout the patient journey. Simply, you just have to pick the right places to dip into that patient journey to create meaningful measurement.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more. let's see. How
I see
should
Meg cleared hers up.
oh
as
yeah.
well.
Did you see the follow-up?
Yeah.
Anyone want to comment on that?
Can you
I
read
was
it,
just
Michelle?
going to say, I mean, if you got I mean, you have access to the representatives. They represent your organization. I mean, I think a simple way to do that is just to make sure that the market research, you could simply ask your representatives kind of what they're hearing from their clinicians. And if there's a vast difference there, then you got to, I'm not a market research guy, but I got to wonder if my market research is very good, right? I think, but I do think that we've seen scenarios where, yeah, I guess it depends on how big the group is and what kind of research you did. But I have seen scenarios in my sales career where some of the direction that we hear about from some of these market researchers doesn't exactly translate to what's actually going on in the community. That can happen.
So for our final question, do you have any change management best practices when shifting compensation structures?
I mean, this is obvious, so this will be my parting thought, and then I'll give it to the panelists. And sorry to leave you with an obvious statement, but you have to enlist those who you're measuring. And if you can create an environment where you're garnering feedback and having discussions and learning what's worked and what hasn't, listening attentively, and enrolling them in the design, not just in the rollout. That's kind of change management 101. But leave you with that. And Michelle, thanks for having me. And, Jim and Jason, it's good to be with you.
Any parting thoughts from you two?
I'll give you my parting thoughts. Incentive communication is enormously important, and it always needs to focus on three things. What's the outcome? What do you want the representative to do differently as a result of it? And what happens when they win? If I can't articulate those three, if I have to spend 20 pages describing the measurement and detailing what doctors they're going to get credit for and how I set their goal, I'm going to miss the opportunity to drive home how it relates to the strategy and what happens when you win.
And I'm going to steal one from Muhammad on my final word and just say keep it as simple as you can. Like Muhammad said, enlist the folks that are going to be impacted by it in the design, not just the rollout. And then finally, just make sure that that it's all communicated in a timely fashion. There's nothing worse than these echo chambers get created when there's not enough information out there. So just be sure that you communicate as quick as you can when it comes to incentive comp, and that'll keep a lot of emails from flying around and phone calls from being made from time to time. So
fantastic. Thank you all for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Komodo Health for sponsoring today's webinar.